It's Ida in Swedish,
okay.
but internationally I go by Ida, I guess.
Okay. And you're a postdoctoral researcher at Stockholm University, is that correct?
Yeah, at Department of Human Geography.
Okay.
Stockholm
and I'm going to ask you kind of mostly about Swedish housing policy and your own research. But first, I was just curious how you got started or how you got interested in becoming a housing policy scholar.
Oh, how it started. I worked as a research assistant at the Institute for Social Research, is called in Sweden. And I worked as this social policy department there, and where people do investigations of the welfare state, or they do comparative welfare state research. But they all leave out housing. So they look at education and unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, and so I became interested in housing because I thought I had missed something in how to understand how people fare. Well, then housing is a big part of that.
Yeah. And our students are going to read this Jim Kemeny article about different kind of corporatist welfare models of and the comparative housing regimes. I mean, it's such an interesting area of research that the U.S. doesn't really engage with very much. But it is, I think, housing is clearly a pillar of the welfare state, right?
It is. So that's how I started. I wrote my master thesis, which actually turned out into the housing deprivation article, where I did a comparative analysis on housing deprivation in Europe. So that's how it started, and then I continued from there to go more locally to investigate housing conditions in Sweden.
So, and there's a number of policies in Sweden I want to ask you about, but first I was hoping, if you can give kind of an overall picture of what you think are the most important housing policies in Sweden.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is, stop me at any point if I need to clarify, because I take so many things for granted so that people know. But first of all, Sweden is the main ideal typical universalist welfare state, which means our government, when our government intervenes in the market, we encompass all residents, the whole population is encompassed in our social policies.
Which is very different from the US, where it's just targeting means testing and only targeting lower income households. Usually.
Exactly. And in housing, this is fulfilled by public housing. So starting there, we have a different concept in social housing. And public housing is rental housing, which is owned by municipal companies, which is managed at the municipal level. And we have 290 municipals in Sweden. So we have some that lacks this municipal housing companies, but we have around 280 municipal housing companies that runs public housing. And but we also have, coupled to the public housing sector, we also have a private rental sector where the government intervenes, of course, because the private rental sector is coupled with the public rental sector through regulations and rent setting system. So when households rent, you can say that they can choose from both the public and the private rental sector without a difference between those two sectors.
So the rent levels are set and they apply to both types of housing.
Yeah, or this have recently changed actually. Since 2011, the private companies do not have to follow the rents in the public rental sector.
That's a big change.
Yeah, it's a big change. Due to EU legislation, we had to adapt the Swedish housing system.
That's surprising. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, we are all doing all kinds of research now looking at the effects of this, but so far, I don't know, I can't say what the effects have been clearly, but well, one thing that we thought was that the rents would go up.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
You would expect that.
Yeah, we expect that. But besides this decoupling between the two private and the public rental sector, we also have what we call it, well, it's market rents basically for newly constructed rental housing.
Okay.
So that we also have allowed that market rents are now.
And how long can a building be having market rents after it's constructed?
For 15 years.
Okay, yeah. So that's because in California, that was a lot of the debates, because we have this state law that prevents cities from adopting rent controls on newer buildings, but it's 1995. It's like a fixed date, and there was a discussion to make it like a 15 years old or older would be the new idea.
Okay.
We probably got that number from Sweden.
Yeah, no, but what happens? We have some apartments that was built 15 years ago now that goes into the system of negotiated rents, and perhaps I should explain that negotiated rents.
Yeah, please.
Because I guess we do not, well, depends on what you call it, what discipline you come from, but I call it negotiated rents. Some people call it rent control, or some people call it rent regulation. But what it is that the what do you call it? I'm looking for a word here. Like the people from like the property owners have one association, and the tenants have one association called the Union of Tenants, and those meet and negotiate the rent levels.
And how do they decide?
Well, we have this system called user value system, where the tenants actually rate different aspects of their housing, and from there they can settle on how much rent is allowed to take, actually.
Oh wow!
So it's based on the individual's user value, how they value their housing.
Wow.
And different aspects, of course, within the house, within your own dwelling, can affect that. If you live up high with a great view, then you pay higher rent. And
yes. And so how many different levels of rent are established? Or like, is this for each unit that you establish a rent, or for tiers of categories?
Yeah, usually you go by landlord by landlord.
Okay, right.
That negotiate for the whole their whole stock. Each
and is it typical that a building will have one owner, or is it typical that there are multiple owners in one building?
No, for rental housing, a typical building have one owner.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because that's like the U.S., but many countries is, condoized kind of individual owners of buildings, and then they rent them out. So.
No, well, that's also like possible. You can sublet if you have a first-hand rental contract, then you can sublet, but it's still rental housing.
Right.
Yeah, the whole building. Yeah, so that's the rental sector, and then we all have this tenure type called what we call tenant ownership. Tenant ownership,
interesting.
That's the cooperative.
The cooperative, okay, right.
Yeah, or I wouldn't call it cooperative because there's no cooperative meaning left of it any longer.
Okay.
That's
it was an ambitious, idealistic name at some point.
Yeah, well, it started out like that in the 1960s. It started out as a thought of cooperative housing. And it still is, but people do not treat it as cooperative housing.
I see. Right.
Like people do not get into that tenure type with the intentions to take care of the building together. But it's rather market-based, like prices are market-based, and brokers are involved when buying and selling into those.
Okay, and so you buy a share in the building or something?
Exactly, you buy a share in the building.
And then how different is the terms from more from a mortgage? I mean, how would that compare? How would that compare to just buying outright a house?
Yeah, from buying outright or being a tenant owner, you have the right to sell and transfer your apartment, and but you do not have the right to sublet it at any terms. And you have to have the local housing association that owns the building. You have to have their approval of if you want to change anything in the apartment, and subletting, and issues that deals with the service of the housing.
Right.
You have to have a approval from the association.
So there's less control, which would make it less expensive probably than just buying a house outright.
Well, it's quite depends on where you are in Sweden, because in Stockholm, tenant-owned apartments are usually most common in the cities, and they can be quite expensive in the
just
cities.
because of the location. Quality.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
And do they match a specific like building type? I mean, is it typical, like, because in the US it's typical that single family houses are owner occupied, and then anything in a building is either going to be a condo or a apartment, like for rent. And you know, there's much more of the multifamily stock is rental than ownership here.
Yeah, so it's the same. Multifamily dwellings are usually rentals or tenant ownership, and then single family housing are always almost private ownership. Right. So tenant ownership can be, or is often multifamily dwellings, but it could also be semi-detached houses, like row houses. Right.
Yeah. And then so with the co-op or with the tenant ownership, is that those are run by different organizations? It's a different municipal organization than the public housing, or it's the same organization?
Yeah, no, it's a local association that is run by the residents in that
okay, so it's area. By the building, I see.
Yeah, so it's by building. But it can be several buildings that constitute one housing association. But it's still a housing.
Interesting. And do they were built under that kind of ownership scheme, or were they changed into that ownership structure?
A lot of them were built into that, but what happens in Stockholm, where I am based, and the biggest city in Sweden with 2 million people, is that a lot of city center apartments that were previously owned by public authorities or public housing, they were converted into tenant ownership, because the political majority gave access to sitting tenants to gave them an option to buy their apartments.
Right.
So the city center actually...
This was in the 80s, I guess.
No, this was the late 90s, actually.
Okay. It was later than other privatization waves of Europe.
Yeah. So the whole city center changed from having quite a large share of public housing to just now, I think it's 7% or something like that left in the city center.
Interesting.
Public housing.
Yeah, they tried this in Hong Kong, the tenant privatization scheme, TPS, but they stopped after. I think it was hard to organize because only some people in a building would choose to participate. And then then you have kind of two parallel ownership structures. I don't know if you.
Yeah.
I mean, are there any stories about that being complicated?
Yeah. This is something that I really want to do research on, and then we are several people wanting to research on this that I have connected into other disciplines, like in law. So
because it seems like it would be a mess if you have like half of the people are tenant owners and then half the people are renting.
Yeah, but we do have we have a rule that says that I think 70%. I'm not sure, but above or around 70% of tenants have to agree,
right?
If to convert the dwelling. But we have, of course, then people who couldn't buy, who now rent from the tenant owner association.
I see. So then the whole building becomes a co-op. essentially.
Yeah.
And the people that couldn't afford to buy in are just renting from the co-op.
Yeah, but then like the incentives for the co-op, they want to, of course, to transfer that dwelling into tenant owner or cooperative as well. So they try to, kick those people out.
I can, yeah. So that would be an interesting study to learn about the experiences of those people that were I assume the least well off in the building.
Yeah, yeah. But also at very attractive areas, at places.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, but I don't know of any research yet.
Yeah, well, and this is something actually that comes up. One of the other things we're going to study in this course and that I'm very interested in is the Thailand community. It's like a community-based urban upgrading program that the government of Thailand has. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but it's called CODI. And so basically it's like in informally developed neighborhoods, there's a government program that the residents can purchase the land and they get money to do upgrading to the infrastructure. But then there's this issue where, like, you can imagine that the better off people in that neighborhood are going to dominate the process. Yeah. And then as they're improving the neighborhood, they're going to want to try to get some people to leave and replace them with wealthier neighbors. So. And then so with the co-op and with the municipal corporations, is there a lot of new construction of those types of housing?
Well, tenant owned are being built.
Being built, okay.
Yeah, but not a lot of rental. I just saw the news the other day that in Stockholm they have decided that the public housing should build 600 new apartments next year.
not very ambitious.
No, that does not.
Well, it's probably, I don't know what the numbers would compare, but it's probably not that. It's probably similarly bad here in Los Angeles. I mean, the city of LA builds a lot of affordable housing, relatively speaking, but it's a city of 4 million people, so
so it's double.
It might be a little more than 600 though.
Yeah, so that's the ambition of the city of Stockholm, but it differs of course too in Sweden. But we do have a housing shortage, severe housing shortage in many places, or in whole of Sweden actually.
Right, and that's very different because there was there was like a million homes program that's in the 60s or something.
Yeah, exactly. Then the ambitions were very high. So we during 10 years we built 1 million new dwellings to house. And that was
I would love to read a history of that program, because one thing that I always wonder about is kind of whether I assume it was private contractors that actually built. And so nowadays, I think there's a lot of problems, at least in California, with how much it costs to build. And so we have like these various low-income housing tax credit programs. And right now in LA, we have a not very ambitious permanent supportive housing initiative to build housing for people experiencing homelessness. But one of the big issues is that the average cost is $500,000 a unit to build these projects. And so I don't think that in the 60s, the Swedish government was spending that much money on each unit. I think they must have had a clever way to do it cheaply, right?
Yeah, and that's also how, this million dwelling program has a really bad reputation, because a lot of it consists of the 6 or 7 story buildings, with prefabricated, the whole house looks like, I don't know, if you have the image of high story building was
just generic,
maintained, so, and also located in the suburbs. So they built a lot of those in the suburbs.
Right.
But I think that's it has a bad reputation, and of course that is due to that they are under maintained and the places there where they were put. But we also have a high share of public housing, which is 2 and 3 stories high buildings across Sweden. So a lot of focus have been on those city close high story apartments.
Yeah, that's actually very similar to the US, where people think about public housing as being these Chicago giant Pruitt-Igoe kind of buildings that were built in the wrong way and very badly maintained and had a lot of problems. But in fact, I think most public housing in the US is bungalow, 2-story, pretty low rise kind of. I mean, in LA, almost all of it is not. I don't think there's any kind of high rise public housing in LA. It's mostly 2-story buildings. Yeah. That now some of them would be like very hip architecturally. I mean, they're kind of like basic style, but because they're from the 40s, they're like retro cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in terms of home ownership, is there still the 60-year mortgage in Sweden?
60-year mortgage?
I remember learning about that, but that might not exist anymore. I learned that there was like a mortgage where you could be paying off the mortgage for 60 years to buy your house.
No, I haven't heard of that.
Maybe
perhaps I'm a younger generation.
Doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, and it was like you could inherit, like you would pass on to the child if the person that had that mortgage passed away or something.
No. Okay. No, now actually it's quite hard to get into the home owning sector if you are not, if you have a down payment, which is 15% of the value of the house, and also to pay to mortgage at least 2%.
Yeah.
Each year. So that's if you enter the home owning sector now. But if you bought your house ages ago, then of course you have better better deals with your bank.
And then with the municipal corporations, are there issues with how they're managed and kind of the decisions they make? I mean, I guess if they're not building new housing, then they're just maintaining. But in terms of building new housing, I mean, the problem in the US many times was that the local housing authority, because we had a vaguely similar system where there would be local housing authorities that would be producing public housing with money from the federal government. But they were often run by like local elites that would put the public house, it was usually a segregated system. And so they would be building some like nicer housing for white households and putting it in a better neighborhood. And then, because they were kind of inherently part of the racist system of housing in the US and urban development, they would be building like housing for Black households and be putting it in like more environmentally damaged neighborhoods. I don't know if that was an issue in Sweden as well.
Well, we had a lot of critique of the million dwelling program, the 1 million dwellings, because they have, or a lot of migrants lives in those housing in the outskirts of city. But we also have, sorry, I lost track. But my kids are screaming outside. So I lost track completely.
No problem.
They came home now.
Okay. And are they going to school in person or no?
Yeah, they go to school or they preschool. Wow. And
okay.
But I have one smaller who's home all the time.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess because a lot of European countries have maintained schools open.
Yeah.
In the US, it's just the bars and the restaurants that are open. And then the schools are not, because we have our priorities backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you were asking about the or how the municipal housing company.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I don't know too much about that, but I have just recently, or I am working right now on an article based on on the very local scale of the city of Malmö, which is located south, all the way south in Sweden, the third biggest city in Sweden, and where we have evaluated a strategy by the municipal housing company that have created areas which are named A, B, and C locations. So they are building like nice housing in the A areas, which is very attractive places, and want people with high incomes and high education and so forth to move in there. While there also a lot of municipal housing have been sold in the least attractive areas, in the C areas. They have been sold to private companies, and we have a lot of actually what do you call those, multinational, like Blackstone and those
Okay,
companies.
yeah, corporate real estate.
Yeah, they have come into the Swedish and made a their strategy to buy up previously municipal housing companies and renovate and kick out the residents and get newer, more wealthier residents. So municipal housing companies, yes, they have these spatial strategies on the local level, which sorts people into the city and increases segregation. But they also have, like, the public housing companies should be directed towards all households.
Yeah, right.
So they should build also these nice areas, but perhaps not in those places.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's
it is strange that
part.
I mean, if you imagine a universalist or kind of egalitarian approach, you would build the same quality of housing everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's the main policy,
I guess. And so you've written, I mean, I really like this paper. I wrote a paper about residualization in the Hong Kong public housing system. So I think this idea of thinking about publicly provided goods as universal is really important. It's not something I think has really ever existed in the United States. I guess maybe with Social Security, even there, it's differentiated by how much money you put in. But maybe you could talk about what, like, the shift and why you think the shift happened. I mean, was there a kind of ideological shift among the leaders of the country where they said, actually, from now on, we don't want to provide the same kinds of goods to everybody, or why might it have happened?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, because I think it's like reinforcing processes that takes place, like that, people turn into home ownership or turn into tenant ownership. Like what's happened in Sweden since 1990 is that the tenant ownership share has risen from 15% to over 20% of households now renting or being a tenant owner. So, and this is the tenure type that has also been built.
Right.
But what happened? I think 1990s was a big deal, that when we changed government after a long period of left government. And so that we call the systematic shift in housing policy, where basically they slashed all the subsidies to the housing sector. So, and rents increased, and also this allowment, like that they allowed tenure conversions, sold out public housing. So I think all those, and then also the under maintenance of public housing that exists, that they were built in the 1960s and they need to be renovated, but they like no one cared. They were so. And
then the wealthier, households that could move out, as the quality diminishes, then people that can leave do leave, and then you end up with the worse off people staying.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, like, interest rates has been very low, so a lot of people have been able to enter the home owning sector.
I see.
But
for the tenant ownership, is there a down payment as well to buy a share? There is. Okay.
You have to have 15% there.
And was income inequality in general increasing in Sweden at the time, or?
Well, 1993 to 1995, we have this huge economical crisis in Sweden, where employment rates grew like 15-20% or something like that.
Okay.
And interest rates went up, but after that, we kind of recovered. But I think that crisis had a lot of effect on the future.
People losing confidence in the government.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear that, because in the US we have this idea that the Nordic countries are so, Northern Europe and the Nordic countries are so egalitarian and providing welfare equally to everybody. But I guess it's less than it used to be.
Yeah, less than it used to be. But like my article on residualization in public housing in Sweden, where we see that a larger share of the households in the public rental sector are poor households. But I also show that, well, compared to the sector in the UK, the residualization levels are quite low in Sweden.
Right.
So we're still quite a mixed.
So it's a similar trend, but not as bad.
Not as bad as in other countries.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Like we can, I think we can't say that the Swedish housing system has completely turned around. I think we still have egalitarian ideals, at least, that we try to.
Right. Well, and it's just, I mean, to me, the even, you know, Hong Kong is 50% of the population lives in publicly built and publicly provided housing. So it's a much larger. So there, I mean, I think part of the problem is as the share of the housing stock that is public goes down, it's you do get into a tension where if we only have, you know, X number of units, well, maybe we should make sure that lower income households, you know, because there is like a moral imperative to, you know, house people that are worse off, right? But then, so if it's going to be a small share of the overall stock that's public, then it's hard to argue that it should be universally available. Although once it is no longer universally available, then like the better off people lose interest, right?
Yeah, I just wrote down the numbers here. I just checked to see that in public housing, actually, it's, well, let me see, because I wrote it down, but now I can't seem to find it. But I see 45% of the households owns their house privately in Sweden, and then we have, I think it's 17% that households that that rents from public housing, and then 15% from public rental sector. So the rental sector together is around 30%.
Okay.
Households.
And then you've done some comparative work on rental housing rates.
Yeah.
That was super interesting.
In Europe.
Right. Yeah. So maybe can you talk about that paper?
Yeah, sure.
It's something that I've actually noticed. I mean, I've not worked in Europe, but I have noticed in kind of other analysis that I've done in Latin America or in Asia, like comparing between countries, you do see that lower income countries have a much higher home ownership rate than higher income countries. And that's sort of the trend you found. Can you tell me about that paper?
Yeah, sure. So this is the paper where I became a housing researcher in the first place. So so what I did, I wanted to use interesting that you mentioned Kemeny before, because I used the Kemeny typology to understand the two different ideal typical types of rental system. One where the Sweden type, where you have a rental sector that is integrated, that is when what I talked about, that the public and the private rental sector, they go together and make like a unitary or integrated rental sector. And one where the rental sector is outside of the market, really, where you have the social housing sector. So these two ideal typical rental system. So I wanted to see what my question that I wanted to answer was how does the organization of the rental sector influence levels of housing deprivation in Europe? Can the rental sector say us something about how
housing deprivation was about the quality of the housing, or
exactly. I measured it as this EU official indicator of housing deprivation that we use to monitor poverty. And for housing, it includes overcrowding, rot in windows or rot in frames, or and lack of toilet, lack of shower and bath, and also if you have a dwelling that is too dark, considered too dark. So those are the items that are measured.
Southern Europe has an advantage in that last one.
Yeah, yeah. Or actually, it's well, if they build tightly, then you can have a too dark dwelling.
Right. True.
Yeah.
True.
Uh,
And so the treatment, if you will, the independent variable is more about how integrated the rental sector is rather than the size of the rental sector.
No, actually the other way around. I use these ideal typical rental sector like the ideal typical rental sector organizations, and then but what I wanted to do was to go beyond those typologies and try to see if the size of the rental sector could indicate either of those typologies.
I see. Right.
So I actually, well, I use the size of the rental sector as an indicator of which type of rental system they have. But so I didn't categorize or used a dummy variable for the rental system. I just used size of rental sector.
Okay.
So I computed that for each country, and what turns out was that a larger, what I call an integrated rental sector, or what Kemeny calls integrated rental sector, then has a protective impact of levels of housing deprivation in Europe. So lower levels of housing deprivation in countries with a larger rental sector. Right.
Yeah, that tracks with how I understand it. I mean, and it's interesting because in the US there's this mantra of like increasing the homeownership rate is an important policy goal, when in fact it seems like in your work it shows that countries with more rental housing actually have better housing quality or lower housing deprivation.
Yeah, but I have done more work on this question actually since that was published, where I include the homeowning market as well. So this is not published yet, but it's a report to the European Commission. And when we include the owning sector, we find that it's actually, when we use later data, I used data from 2013, I think, in my article. And when we used more recent data, it's actually the number of outright owners that is positively associated with higher levels of housing deprivation. And those are typically countries it's not too hard to explain. That's typically Eastern European countries, where after the transition,
there was
a lot
a
of
big
people
sale.
to outright ownership, and Southern European countries.
Right. Yep.
Which have.
I think if you did it globally, you would find that trend applies.
Yeah. While Sweden has a lot of mortgage owners, if you make that division between outright ownership and mortgage ownership.
Right.
So we also have a large rental sector, but we also have a large share of mortgage owners. So
interesting.
So that also tells us something about the financial situation in the country that determines type of housing system that have developed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think it really reflects on a lot of institutional capacity. I mean, to use a term of art, institutional capacity. I mean, just, in order to have a functioning rental sector, you need to have a lot of property rights and rules and all these things that are in place and they're hard to manage in many places. I mean, this idea of having landlord and tenant organizations that negotiate appropriate rents, I mean, that depends on a lot of social institutions that most countries don't have, I think.
And corporatism.
Yeah, sure, right.
Yeah.
And so I did want to ask you about your other paper, because I have also always wanted to write a paper about the Oswald hypothesis.
The Oswald, yeah.
The famous Oswald hypothesis. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah, well, Oswald found this association between the extent of home ownership and unemployment. So I bumped
and his idea was that if there's a lot of home ownership, then you can't move as easily, and if you can't move as easily, then you can't go get a new job in a different city, right?
Yeah, you're stuck in home ownership.
Right.
transition costs are too high to relocate youngers. So yeah, I thought this association was very intriguing, and I really wanted to explore this. So I just bumped into one of his articles in 2013 or 14 and something. I haven't heard of it before that, so so it was new to me. And it was this typical American association as well that I wanted to explore in a Swedish setting to see if it also holds in a Swedish setting. And as I show in my article, it does. We consistently found that in regions with higher home ownership also have higher unemployment levels. So we showed that for a bunch of years, I think 2010 or 8 years or something like that.
But then you go beyond that simple association.
Yeah. We wanted since we have so good data in Sweden. This is something I should mention. We have administrative registers covering every individual in Sweden. Of course, anonymized, so we can't identify people.
Right.
But every individual is in there. I am in there, and well, everyone else. So we have this access to this data, which allows us to do very good research to explore like micro processes on the individual level. So what we did was to, of course, control for look at the association between being a homeowner and being unemployed, but also then control for a lot of individual factors that can explain your being unemployed.
Right.
But what was most important to understand the regional or the aggregate pattern or the aggregate relationship between home ownership and unemployment. We took into account other regional factors that could explain this association. So what we found is that number of workplaces, the size of the labor market actually explains a lot of the unemployment in regions with high home ownership rates, because those regions with high home ownership rates, at least in Sweden, are usually regions with a small labor market where people are not have good matches on their on the labor market.
Yeah, so it was a spurious correlation a little bit. I mean, I think that's something that I always wondered about, that argument that high home ownership rates were associated with unemployment, just because of what we were talking about before, right? I mean, I think that big cities, have lower unemployment rates and more rental housing. So but it's because they're big cities, not because of the
not because of the home ownership rate. Yeah, exactly. So we kind of, being a geographer, we kind of raised the question, it's geography, stupid.
Yes. And also, I wonder, there was, when I was looking at that abstract, I was thinking about like the ecological fallacy issue. I mean, I'm sure people have studied this with the Oswald hypothesis, but just like even in a region where there's higher home ownership and higher unemployment, it's probably the tenants that are more unemployed. I mean, at least in a US perspective, it would be the homeowners that are going to be more likely to be employed. So actually, like within regions, the match isn't the same.
Yeah. So we, that's why we looked into individual level data where we can assess whether the individual was a homeowner or a renter. And we also found that pattern, of course, that renters have a higher propensity or likelihood to be unemployed.
Yeah, makes sense.
Irregardless of region.
Right. Super interesting. Well, I'm so glad we got to talk about your research. It's very cool stuff.